The crystal spires of the royal palace stretched toward three purple moons, their surfaces gleaming with an otherworldly light that hurt human eyes. Inside the highest tower, Queen pressed her elongated fingers against her temples, her silver skin growing pale with exhaustion. The sound echoing through the palace walls would have shattered glass on Earth, but here it only made every living being within 50 kilometers want to flee. The baby dragon screams. Sarah had been working as a servant in the palace for exactly 73 days. She counted each one carefully, marking them on a small piece of cloth she kept hidden in her uniform pocket. Today was supposed to be like any other day of endless cleaning, polishing crystal surfaces that never seemed to stay clean, and avoiding the attention of the nobles who treated humans like useful furniture. The screaming had been going on for 6 hours straight. Sarah pushed her cleaning cart down the marble corridor, her worn shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The sound of the dragon's cries grew louder as she approached the royal quarters. Other servants rushed past her in the opposite direction, their faces twisted with pain and fear. Even with their naturally enhanced hearing, looked ready to collapse. "Another sleepless night," muttered a fellow human servant who had been at the palace for over 2 years. His hair had gone completely gray during his time here, though he was only 35. "That little beast has been at it for days now. The queen looks ready to exile it to the outer moons." Sarah stopped walking. The idea of exiling a baby anything made her stomach turn. Back on Earth, before the Empire had conquered her planet, she had worked at a center. She knew the sound of distress when she heard it, even if it came from a creature that could probably melt steel with its breath. "Has anyone tried to figure out what's wrong with it?" she asked. Looked at her like she had suggested flying to the nearest star. "Are you insane? That's the Queen's dragon. Nobody goes near it except the royal caretakers, and they've been trying everything for weeks. Besides, it's not our problem. We clean, we serve food, we stay invisible. That's how humans survive here." The screaming intensified, and Sarah watched as a group of courtiers stumbled past them, their usually perfect posture bent with pain. One of them, a tall female with intricate tattoos covering her arms, actually fell to her knees. "This can't continue," the courtier gasped. "The queen will have to make a decision soon." Sarah knew what that meant. In culture, anything that caused prolonged disruption to the royal household was eliminated, even a baby dragon. That evening, Sarah sat in her tiny quarters in the servants' wing, staring at the rough stone walls. The screaming had finally stopped, but the silence felt ominous rather than peaceful. Through the thin walls, she could hear other human servants whispering. "I heard the queen called for the executioner," someone said. "Poor little thing probably doesn't even know what it did wrong," another voice replied. "Dragons are just animals," a third voice argued. "Smart animals, but still animals. It's not like it's really suffering." Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that desperate crying echoing through the palace. It reminded her of Tommy, a 3-year-old at her who used to have terrible night terrors. His parents had been at their wits' end until Sarah figured out that singing old nursery rhymes helped calm him down. The next morning brought fresh screaming, somehow even louder than before. Sarah watched as servants and nobles alike fled the main corridors, seeking refuge in the lower levels of the palace. Even the kitchen staff, usually immune to distractions while preparing the elaborate meals, looked ready to abandon their posts. Head servant, a stern with skin like polished copper, gathered all the human workers in the main hall. His usually perfect composure showed cracks of strain. "The situation has become critical," he announced, his voice carrying the formal tone that all used when addressing humans. "Her Majesty has decreed that the dragon must be removed from the palace within 2 days. If the royal caretakers cannot resolve the issue, the creature will be disposed of." A murmur ran through the assembled humans. Even though they were slaves in all but name, most of them still retained enough humanity to feel sorrow for a doomed infant. "Until then," continued, "all non-essential personnel are to remain in the lower levels. Only designated food servers and emergency cleaners are permitted in the upper floors." Sarah raised her hand, surprising herself with her boldness. "Sir, what exactly have the caretakers tried?" His large, dark eyes fixed on her with the kind of attention that usually meant trouble for a human. "That is not your concern, servant." "I'm just curious," Sarah persisted, feeling the stares of her fellow humans burning into her back. "I worked with difficult children back on Earth. Sometimes the solution is simpler than people think. Dragons are not human children, replied coldly. They are ancient, powerful beings with complex magical needs. The royal caretakers are experts with decades of experience. They have tried every known method of dragon care. But have they tried singing to it? The question slipped out before Sarah could stop herself. The hall fell completely silent except for the distant screaming from the tower above. Stared at her as if she had just suggested teaching the dragon to do arithmetic. Singing, he repeated slowly. Yes, sir. Sometimes when bobbies cry for no apparent reason, it's because they're overwhelmed by their environment. Singing can provide a familiar, rhythmic sound that helps them feel safe. Was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry she had just earned herself a one-way trip to the palace dungeons. Finally, he spoke. The caretakers have tried musical instruments, lullabies, even recordings of dragon songs from the home world. Nothing has worked. Human singing is different, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she thought about all the children she had helped over the years. We don't have the enhanced vocal range that do. Our voices are simpler, more basic. Maybe that's what the dragon needs. You would risk your life on this theory. Sarah thought about Tommy and all the other children who had found comfort in her voice during their darkest moments. She thought about the baby dragon, alone and frightened in a palace full of strangers who might kill it if it couldn't stop crying. Yes, sir, I would. Studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, but understand that if you fail, if you further agitate the creature or cause any harm to it, you will face the Queen's justice. Sarah knew what justice looked like. She had seen the punishment chambers during her first week at the palace, but she also knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try to help. An hour later, Sarah found herself standing outside the door to the royal nursery, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the tower could hear it. The screaming was deafening at this distance, a sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Caretaker, an elderly with deep blue skin and eyes like chips of ice, looked at her with barely concealed disgust. You are the human who thinks she can succeed where we have failed. I'd like to try, sir. The creature has not stopped its vocalizations for more than a few minutes in 4 days. It refuses food, will not sleep, and shows signs of severe distress. We have consulted the finest dragon experts in the Empire. May I see it? His expression suggested that allowing a human into the royal nursery was roughly equivalent to letting a wild animal loose in a museum. But his orders came from the Queen herself, filtered through head servant. You may observe from the doorway. Do not attempt to approach the creature unless I give explicit permission. The nursery was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The walls were covered in some kind of soft, luminescent material that pulsed gently with warm light. The floor was heated stone, perfect for a creature that needed constant warmth. Exotic plants from a dozen worlds created a garden-like atmosphere, and a small pool of crystal-clear water bubbled in one corner. In the center of the room, on a bed of soft silk cushions, lay the baby dragon. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had expected something frightening, a miniature version of the massive war dragons she had seen in propaganda vids. Instead, she saw a creature no larger than a house cat, with scales that shimmered between deep green and silver. Its wings were translucent like a butterfly's, and its eyes were enormous in its small head. It looked absolutely terrified. The baby dragon's mouth was open as it screamed, revealing tiny, perfectly formed teeth. Its whole body shook with each cry, and its wings fluttered helplessly. Sarah could see the exhaustion in every line of its small form. How long since it hatched? She asked. 6 days, replied. It was normal for the first 2 days, feeding well, sleeping appropriately. Then it began this behavior and has not stopped. Sarah studied the dragon's posture, the way it curled in on itself between screams. It reminded her of children who had been overstimulated, who needed comfort but didn't know how to ask for it. Has it been around other dragons since hatching? The Queen is its mother, obviously, but she has her duties to the Empire. She visits twice daily for feeding and basic care. What about constant companionship? Dragons are social creatures, aren't they? Sai's blue eyes narrowed. You suggest the creature is lonely? It has everything it could possibly need. Food, warmth, shelter, toys appropriate for its development stage. But no one's staying with it all the time. Dragon mothers do not coddle their young. Independence is encouraged from an early age. Sarah thought about human bobbies, how they needed almost constant contact and attention in their first months of life. Maybe dragon bobbies were different, but maybe they weren't as different as everyone assumed. "Could I try sitting with it?" she asked. "Not touching, just being present." Looked like he wanted to refuse, but after another particularly ear-splitting shriek from the dragon, he nodded reluctantly. "You may sit by the wall. Any sudden movements, any sign that you are distressing the creature further, and you will be removed immediately." Sarah entered the nursery slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. The warm air carried scents she couldn't identify, exotic and somehow soothing. She settled against the far wall, far enough from the dragon to not seem threatening, but close enough that her presence would be noticed. The baby dragon's screaming faltered for a moment as it registered the new person in the room. Its enormous eyes fixed on Sarah, studying her with an intelligence that was startling in such a small creature. Then it resumed crying, but Sarah thought she heard a slight change in tone. Less panic, more questioning. She began to hum. It was an old song her grandmother had sung to her, something simple and repetitive with a gentle melody. Sarah had hummed it to countless children over the years, and it had never failed to provide at least some comfort. The dragon's cries stuttered. Its head tilted slightly, as if trying to understand this new sound. Sarah continued humming, keeping her voice low and steady. She could feel skeptical gaze on her, but she ignored him. All her attention was focused on the small, frightened creature across the room. Gradually, the screaming subsided to whimpers. The dragon's breathing slowed, though it continued to watch Sarah with wide, wary eyes. "Interesting," murmured. "Continue." Sarah transitioned from humming to soft singing, still using the same simple melody, but now adding words. Not the original lyrics, which were in Mandarin and probably wouldn't mean anything to a dragon, but instead she began listing things she could see in the room. Soft green plants growing by the wall, crystal water bubbling in the pool, warm light dancing on the stone, little dragon safe and whole. It was nonsense, really, but it was rhythmic and soothing. The dragon's whimpers grew quieter, and its body began to relax slightly. Sarah kept singing, making up new verses about everything she could observe. The dragon's scales, the way the light played across the ceiling, the comfortable temperature of the room. Her voice was nothing special, just a plain human voice without enhancement or training, but something about it seemed to reach the frightened baby. After 20 minutes, the dragon had stopped crying entirely. It lay curled on its cushions, eyes still fixed on Sarah but no longer wide with panic. Its breathing had become deep and regular. "Remarkable," breathed. "In 4 days, nothing has calmed it for more than a few moments." Sarah continued singing, afraid to break the spell. The dragon's eyes began to droop, and for the first time since the crisis began, it looked like it might actually fall asleep. But then Sarah's throat began to feel dry. She had been singing for almost half an hour and her voice was starting to crack. As her volume decreased, the dragon's eyes snapped open again, and it let out a small, plaintive cry. "It wants you to keep singing," observed unnecessarily. Sarah cleared her throat and resumed, but she knew she couldn't keep this up indefinitely. Her voice was already getting hoarse, and she would need water soon. "What happens when I have to stop?" she asked between verses. Was silent for a long moment, watching as the dragon settled back into its relaxed state. "I do not know. This is unprecedented." Sarah sang for another hour before her voice gave out completely. The moment she stopped, the dragon began crying again, though not with the same desperate intensity as before. It seemed more like a protest than panic. "I need water," Sarah croaked. "Of course," gestured to another caretaker who had been watching from the doorway. "Bring water immediately." As Sarah sipped gratefully from a crystal glass, she watched the dragon's distress levels rise again. Not to the heights of before, but enough to make everyone in the room wince. "This is problematic," said. "You cannot sing continuously. The creature will need to learn to cope without constant vocalization." Sarah thought about the children she had worked with, how they needed different amounts of comfort and attention. Some needed to be held constantly in their first weeks. Others were content with just knowing someone was nearby. "Maybe it doesn't need constant singing," she suggested. "Maybe it just needs to know someone is there. Could I try staying in the room for a longer period? Singing periodically but not continuously." Looked uncertain. The queen will need to approve any extended presence of a human in the royal nursery. Then let's ask her. Queen was smaller than Sarah had expected. The ruler stood barely 6 feet tall, though her presence filled the throne room like a physical force. Her silver skin seemed to glow with internal light, and her eyes were the deep purple of her sky. Sarah knelt on the cold marble floor as protocol demanded, but she could feel the queen's gaze studying her with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "You are the human who stopped my child's distress," the queen said. Her voice carried harmonics that made Sarah's bones resonate. "Temporarily, Your Majesty. I believe it needs more consistent comfort and attention." "Explain." Sarah took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Human bobbies need almost constant care and attention in their first months of life. They panic when left alone because they're not yet developed enough to understand that they're safe. Maybe dragon bobbies have similar needs. The queen's expression remained unreadable. Dragon mothers do not coddle their offspring. Independence is vital for survival. But maybe there's a difference between coddling and providing basic emotional security. The baby isn't asking for constant entertainment or stimulation. It just seems to need to know that it's not alone. And you believe your voice provides this security. I think any consistent, caring presence might help. My voice just happens to be what worked. Queen was silent for so long that Sarah began to worry she had overstepped badly. Finally, the queen spoke. "The traditional methods have failed. The child's distress threatens its health and the functioning of the palace. You will be assigned to the royal nursery on a temporary basis. If the child's condition improves, the arrangement will continue. If it worsens, or if you prove unreliable in any way, you will face immediate punishment." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she nodded. "I understand, Your Majesty. You will work in shifts with the regular caretakers. Your duties will be limited to providing comfort and vocal soothing. You are not to handle the child, feed it, or make any decisions regarding its care without explicit permission from caretaker." "Yes, Your Majesty." "One more thing." The queen's purple eyes seemed to look straight through Sarah. "If you harm my child in any way, intentionally or through negligence, your death will be neither quick nor merciful." That evening, Sarah sat in the royal nursery as the 3 moons rose outside the crystal windows. The baby dragon lay curled on its cushions, not asleep but quiet and calm. Sarah hummed softly, occasionally breaking into simple songs when the dragon seemed restless. It was the strangest job she had ever had. She was essentially a living lullaby device for an alien creature that could probably incinerate her if it ever grew up to resent her presence. But as she watched the baby dragon's peaceful breathing and saw its scales shimmer in the moonlight, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Earth. "Purpose." The dragon stirred slightly and made a small sound, not quite a cry but not quite contentment either. Sarah began to sing again, making up lyrics as she went. "Little dragon, safe and sound, gentle light all around, soft cushions for your bed, peaceful thoughts in your head." The dragon's breathing deepened, and Sarah thought she saw something that might have been a smile on its tiny features. Of course, she had no idea if dragons could smile, but the expression looked content. Over the next several days, Sarah developed a routine. She would arrive at the nursery early in the morning and spend 12 hours there, taking breaks only for meals and necessary bodily functions. During her breaks, other caretakers would stay with the dragon, but inevitably it would become agitated until Sarah returned. She learned to pace herself, alternating between humming, soft singing, and quiet talking. The dragon seemed to respond well to all forms of human vocalization, as long as they were gentle and consistent. Caretaker, initially skeptical of Sarah's methods, began to show grudging respect as the dragon's condition improved dramatically. It started eating regularly again, taking proper naps, and even showing interest in the toys scattered around the nursery. "The child has gained weight," reported to Sarah during her 3rd week in the nursery. "Its sleep patterns have normalized, and its stress indicators have decreased by over 60%. Sarah felt a warm glow of satisfaction. It just needed to feel safe. "Perhaps, though I admit I do not fully understand why your voice succeeds where ours fail." Sarah had been thinking about that herself. "Maybe it's because I'm not trying to be impressive or sophisticated. I'm not using enhancement or training or trying to demonstrate my skill. I'm just being present." The dragon chose that moment to make a small chirping sound, the first vocalization it had made that wasn't a cry of distress. Both Sarah and turned to look at it, and the baby dragon chirped again, as if pleased to have their attention. "Well," said dryly, "at least it has found its voice." Word of the human who could calm the royal dragon spread throughout the palace. Servants who had fled to the lower levels returned to their duties, nobles stopped wearing the painful expressions they had worn for weeks, and the general atmosphere of the palace shifted from stressed tension to curious interest. Sarah found herself in the peculiar position of being both the most valuable and most vulnerable human in the entire complex. Her success with the dragon had earned her a measure of protection, but it had also made her irreplaceable in a way that could be dangerous if anything went wrong. She tried not to think about what would happen if the dragon grew out of its need for her voice, or if it ever got sick or hurt while under her care. Instead, she focused on the simple pleasure of helping a young creature feel safe and loved. Because that's what it came down to, she realized. Love. Not romantic love or even the specific love of a parent for a child, but the basic love that any caretaker should feel for someone in their charge. The dragons, and for all their sophistication and power, had somehow missed this fundamental truth. Care wasn't about providing the best food or the most comfortable environment or the most educational toys. Care was about making another being feel valued and protected. It was about being present not just physically, but emotionally. As Sarah sang the baby dragon to sleep that night, she wondered if she was teaching it something important about the universe. In her simple human way, with her unremarkable human voice, she was showing it that not all powerful beings used their strength to hurt or control. Some used their power to comfort and protect. The dragon's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of true sleep, and Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she knew her situation in the palace remained precarious. But tonight, a baby creature was sleeping peacefully because someone cared enough to sing away its fears. And that, Sarah thought, was worth whatever risks lay ahead. 3 months had passed since Sarah first entered the royal nursery, and the palace had transformed around her success. The baby dragon, whom she had begun privately calling Spark because of the way its scales caught the light, had grown considerably. It was now the size of a medium dog, with wings that could carry it across the room in short bursts and a voice that could produce sounds other than screams. Sarah had developed an entire repertoire of songs, stories, and gentle conversation topics that kept Spark content. But more importantly, she had begun to understand the young dragon's personality. Spark was curious about everything, brave to the point of recklessness, and surprisingly affectionate for a creature that was supposedly being raised for independence. The problem was that Spark was becoming too attached to her. "The child follows you with its eyes constantly," caretaker observed during one of their daily meetings. "When you leave for meals, it becomes agitated within minutes. This level of dependence is concerning." Sarah watched Spark playing with a puzzle toy designed to challenge its growing intelligence. The dragon solved it easily, then looked to her for approval with bright, eager eyes. "It's normal for young creatures to form strong attachments to their primary caregiver," Sarah said. "It shows healthy social development. But it shows no such attachment to any, including its own mother. The queen visits daily, yet the child shows more excitement when you enter the room than when she does." This was true, and it worried Sarah more than she was willing to admit. Queen's visits had become increasingly tense as it became clear that Spark preferred the human servant to its own royal mother. The queen never said anything directly, but Sarah could see the hurt and confusion in her purple eyes. "Maybe we need to work on building other relationships," Sarah suggested. "I could step back gradually while encouraging interactions with other caretakers." "We have tried. The moment you are absent for more than an hour, the child begins its distress vocalizations again." Sarah sighed. She had created a wonderful solution to the original problem, but in doing so, she had created an entirely new problem. Spark was healthy and happy, but only when she was present. The dragon had become completely dependent on her in a way that couldn't continue indefinitely. "What does the queen want to do?" His expression grew carefully neutral. "Her Majesty is considering various options." That evening, Sarah was summoned to the throne room again. This time, she was not alone. A human woman she didn't recognize stood beside her, along with several officials Sarah had seen around the palace but never spoken to. Queen looked older than she had 3 months ago. The stress of the situation was showing in the tightness around her eyes and the way she held her shoulders. "The situation with my child has become untenable," the Queen began without preamble. "While your intervention was successful in addressing the immediate crisis, it has created a new problem that threatens the child's proper development." Sarah's heart began to pound. "Your Majesty, if you'd like me to try reducing my time with Spark." "Spark?" Sarah realized her mistake immediately. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I've been calling the dragon Spark privately. I know it's not my place to name it." The Queen's expression was unreadable. "Continue with your explanation." "I could try spending less time in the nursery, allowing other caretakers to build relationships with the dragon. We have attempted this approach. The child becomes so distressed that it refuses food and shows physical signs of illness. The situation is unacceptable." Sarah felt cold dread spreading through her chest. "What are you proposing, Your Majesty?" "We have consulted with experts from across the Empire. The consensus is that the child has formed an inappropriate bond that must be broken for its own good." "Broken how?" The Queen gestured to the unknown human woman. "This is Doctor, a human behavioral specialist who has experience with separation issues in various species. She will be taking over your duties in the nursery." Sarah stared at Doctor, a stern-looking woman with gray hair and intelligent eyes. "You're replacing me." "The transition will be gradual," Doctor said in a crisp, professional voice. "I'll work alongside you for a week, then slowly take over primary care duties while you phase out your interactions with the dragon. And if Spark doesn't accept the transition?" "The child will adapt," Queen said firmly. "It must adapt. A dragon cannot be dependent on a single individual, especially not a human servant." That night, Sarah lay awake in her small quarters, staring at the ceiling. She understood the logic behind the Queen's decision. Spark couldn't be completely dependent on one person for its entire life. But she also knew how traumatic sudden separation could be for a young creature that had formed a primary attachment. She thought about children she had worked with whose parents had suddenly disappeared from their lives due to divorce, death, or other circumstances. The trauma could last for years and affect every future relationship they formed. The next morning, Doctor arrived in the nursery with a collection of scientific instruments and a very serious demeanor. She immediately began taking notes on everything from the temperature of the room to Spark's behavioral patterns. "Interesting," she murmured as she watched Spark chirp excitedly when Sarah entered. "The attachment response is quite pronounced." Spark flew over to Sarah and perched on her shoulder, something it had learned to do in recent weeks as its flying abilities improved. The dragon nuzzled her neck affectionately and made the soft, trilling sound that Sarah had learned meant contentment. "How do you propose we handle the separation?" Sarah asked Doctor. "Gradual reduction of your presence, combined with behavioral conditioning to redirect the dragon's attachment needs toward more appropriate targets." "Meaning other?" "Ideally, yes, or toward objects and activities rather than specific individuals. Excessive attachment is a weakness that could be exploited by enemies or could interfere with the dragon's future role as a royal guardian." Sarah felt a flash of anger. "It's not excessive attachment, it's normal emotional development. Spark needs to feel secure before it can learn independence." "Perhaps, but the current situation is clearly unsustainable." Doctor's approach was methodical and scientifically sound. She spent the first few days observing and taking notes, then began introducing herself to Spark while Sarah was present. The dragon was polite but uninterested, clearly preferring Sarah's attention. "The subject shows minimal response to my voice or presence," Doctor noted. "We may need to accelerate the transition timeline." "Give it more time," Sarah pleaded. "Spark needs to get to know you before I start stepping back." But time was not something they had. On the fourth day of Doctor's presence, Queen arrived with several royal advisors and a man Sarah didn't recognize, but who made her skin crawl just by looking at him. "This is Commander," the Queen announced. "He is an expert in dragon training and combat conditioning." Commander had the look of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with force. His eyes were cold and calculating as he studied Spark, who had immediately hidden behind Sarah when the group entered. "Excessive coddling," he said dismissively. The creature has been allowed to develop emotional weaknesses that will interfere with its training. We should separate it from the human immediately and begin proper conditioning. The transition was supposed to be gradual, Sarah protested. Gradual transitions are for creatures without royal responsibilities, replied. This dragon will one day be expected to fight and possibly die for the Empire. It cannot be allowed to maintain emotional dependencies. Sarah felt Spark trembling against her back where the dragon had taken refuge. It's still a baby. It doesn't need combat conditioning yet. It needs to learn that the universe is not a safe place where it will always be comforted, said harshly. The sooner it learns this lesson, the better. Queen looked conflicted. Perhaps we should allow Doctor more time to implement her plan. Your Majesty, with respect, the human's influence over your child has become a security risk, argued. What if she were to be compromised by enemies of the Empire? What if she were to use her influence to turn the dragon against you? Sarah saw the fear flicker in the Queen's eyes. The idea that a human servant could somehow corrupt the royal dragon was exactly the kind of paranoia that had led to Earth's conquest in the first place. I would never hurt Spark, Sarah said quietly. All I've ever tried to do is help. Perhaps, said, but intentions change. Loyalty can be bought or coerced. A dragon cannot be allowed to have such vulnerabilities. That evening, Sarah was told that the transition would begin immediately. Starting the next morning, Doctor would take over primary care duties, and Sarah would be limited to 1 hour of contact per day, decreasing by 15 minutes each week until her presence was no longer required. Sarah spent her last full day in the nursery trying to memorize every detail. The way Spark's scales shifted color depending on the light, the soft sound the dragon made when it was happy, the weight of its small body when it perched on her shoulder. I don't know what's going to happen, she told Spark quietly while Doctor was out of the room. But I need you to be brave. You're going to have to learn to trust other people. Spark chirped questioningly, sensing her distress but not understanding its source. I'll always care about you, Sarah whispered. Even if I can't be here, remember that someone loved you enough to sing away your nightmares. The next morning brought chaos. Doctor arrived early to take over the morning feeding routine, while Sarah was relegated to sitting in the corner. Spark immediately began showing signs of distress when it realized something was different. The dragon refused to eat from Doctor's hands and flew to Sarah, clinging to her desperately. When Sarah gently tried to encourage Spark to go to Doctor for food, the dragon began the high-pitched crying that everyone in the palace had learned to dread. This is exactly what we expected, Doctor said calmly, making notes while Spark screamed. The subject will experience initial distress, but it will learn to adapt when it realizes that its previous caregiver is no longer available. It's terrified, Sarah said, her heart breaking as she watched Spark's obvious panic. Fear is a learning tool. The subject will learn that its survival depends on accepting care from appropriate sources. Sarah was required to leave the nursery after her allocated hour, despite Spark's increasingly desperate attempts to follow her. She could hear the dragon's cries echoing through the halls as she walked away, and she had to fight every instinct that told her to run back. The separation protocol was a nightmare. Each day, Spark became more agitated and fearful. It stopped eating properly, refused to sleep through the night, and became aggressive toward anyone except Sarah during her brief daily visits. The subject is showing signs of severe separation anxiety, Doctor reported to Queen after a week. This is within normal parameters for the transition process, but the intensity is concerning. How long before it adapts? The Queen asked. Typically 2 to 3 weeks. However, this case is more severe than average due to the depth of the original attachment. Sarah's daily visits became exercises in heartbreak. Spark would cling to her desperately for the entire hour, becoming increasingly frantic as the time to leave approached. The dragon had stopped growing, its scales had lost their luster, and its eyes held a sadness that was painful to witness. This is torture, Sarah told after a particularly difficult visit. We're traumatizing it for no good reason. The Queen believes it is necessary for the child's proper development, replied, but Sarah could see that he was troubled by Spark's condition. Spark is getting sicker every day. Look at it, really look. His expression grew pained. In his decades of caring for dragons, he had never seen a young one deteriorate so rapidly from purely emotional distress. 2 weeks into the separation protocol, disaster struck. Sarah arrived for her daily visit to find the nursery in chaos. Doctor was standing over Spark's still form while caretaker frantically tried to take vital signs. "What happened?" Sarah demanded, rushing to Spark's side. "The subject collapsed during the morning feeding routine," Doctor explained clinically. "It appears to be suffering from severe dehydration and exhaustion." Sarah could see that Spark was barely breathing. The dragon's eyes were closed and its scales had faded to a dull gray. It looked like it was dying. "It's not eating or drinking enough," said urgently. "Its body is shutting down from the stress." Sarah knelt beside Spark and began to sing softly, the same simple melody she had used months ago to first calm the baby dragon. Spark's breathing immediately became less labored, and its eyes fluttered open. "Remarkable," Doctor murmured. "The response is immediate." "Because it knows it's safe now," Sarah said angrily. "We're killing it with this separation." Within minutes of Sarah's presence, Spark began to show signs of improvement. It managed to drink a small amount of water and even took a few bites of food. But when Sarah's hour was up and she was required to leave, Spark immediately began deteriorating again. "This cannot continue," declared. "The child will die if we maintain the current protocol." Doctor looked frustrated, but had to agree. "The separation anxiety is more severe than any case I've encountered. The attachment appears to have a physiological component that we hadn't anticipated." That evening, Sarah was again summoned to the throne room. This time, Queen looked exhausted and defeated. "My child is dying," the Queen said simply. "The experts tell me that continuing the separation will likely result in its death within days." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. "Spark just needs to feel loved and secure. That's not weakness, Your Majesty. That's the foundation that allows someone to become truly strong. Yet you are human, and my child is destined to outlive you by centuries. What happens when age takes you from it? Will it simply die of grief?" It was a fair question, one that Sarah had been thinking about constantly. "I don't know, but I think there might be a way to help Spark form other attachments while maintaining our bond. Not replacement, but expansion." "Explain." "Back on Earth, we had a concept called secure attachment. Children who felt completely safe with their primary caregiver were actually better at forming relationships with others, not worse. Maybe if Spark feels totally secure with me, it will have the confidence to trust other people too." Queen considered this. "You would be willing to remain in the palace permanently, to dedicate your life to my child's care." Sarah thought about her old life on Earth, which seemed like something that had happened to someone else. "Yes, Your Majesty, but not as the only person in Spark's life, as the person who makes it feel safe enough to love others." The Queen was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than Sarah had ever heard it. "Perhaps we have misunderstood the nature of strength. We believed that independence required isolation, that attachment was weakness. But watching my child suffer has taught me that some bonds are so fundamental that breaking them destroys rather than strengthens." She paused, looking directly at Sarah with an expression that was almost vulnerable. "There is wisdom in your human approach that we have overlooked. Very well. You will return to full-time care of my child, but with a new mandate. You will help it form additional attachments while maintaining the security of your bond. You will teach it that love does not weaken, but empowers." Sarah felt tears of relief running down her cheeks. "Thank you, Your Majesty." "Do not thank me yet. This is an experiment that has never been tried. If it fails, if my child grows up unable to fulfill its duties because it has been made soft by too much affection, the responsibility will be yours." That night, Sarah returned to the nursery to find Spark barely conscious. The dragon's condition had worsened dramatically in the few hours since her last visit. Doctor and were discussing emergency medical intervention, but Sarah could see in their eyes that they thought it might be too late. Sarah sat beside Spark and began to sing, pouring all her love and determination into her voice. She sang about safety and belonging, about being cherished and protected. She sang about a future where Spark would be strong and confident because it had been loved unconditionally when it needed it most. Slowly, Spark's breathing steadied. The dragon's eyes opened, focusing on Sarah's face with an expression of profound relief and trust. Color began to return to its scales, and it managed to lift its head slightly. "I'm here," Sarah whispered. "I'm not going anywhere. You're safe now." Over the following hours, Spark's condition stabilized and then began to improve rapidly. By morning, the dragon was alert enough to eat a full meal and even showed interest in its toys again. Doctor was fascinated by the dramatic turnaround. "I've never seen anything like it. The physiological response to your presence appears to be immediate and profound." "It's not just my presence," Sarah explained. "It's the feeling of being unconditionally loved. Spark knows that no matter what happens, someone will always be there who cares about it above everything else." "And you believe this will make it stronger rather than weaker?" Sarah looked at Spark, who was playing happily while keeping one eye on her to make sure she hadn't disappeared. "I know it will. Children who feel completely secure are the ones who grow up to take healthy risks, to trust others, to face challenges with confidence. Spark will be the strongest dragon in the Empire because it knows what love feels like." Doctor made notes, but Sarah could see she was beginning to understand. Sometimes the most sophisticated approach was wrong, and the simplest human truth was right. Love didn't make someone weak. Love made them brave enough to be strong. 2 years had transformed both Spark and the entire Empire's understanding of strength, attachment, and the nature of power itself. What had begun as a desperate attempt to calm a screaming baby dragon had evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history. Spark was now the size of a small horse, with iridescent scales that could shift from deep emerald to brilliant silver depending on the light. The dragon's wings could carry it across vast distances, and its intelligence had developed far beyond anything the royal caretakers had expected. But most remarkably, Spark had indeed learned to form multiple strong attachments while maintaining its primary bond with Sarah. The transformation hadn't been limited to the dragon. Queen herself had begun spending more time in the nursery, not out of duty, but out of genuine desire to understand her child better. Sarah had gradually coached the Queen on how to read Spark's emotional needs, how to provide comfort without overwhelming, and most importantly, how to show love in ways that a dragon could understand. "The child responds differently to each of us," Queen observed during one of their evening conversations in the nursery. Spark was curled between them, completely relaxed and content. "With you, it seeks comfort and security. With me, it shows respect and seeks approval. With Caretaker, it demonstrates its learning and skills." Sarah nodded, watching as Spark's scales shimmered in response to its mother's voice. "Healthy children form different types of relationships with different people. Each bond serves a purpose in their development. Yet without you as the foundation, none of the other relationships would exist." This was true, and it remained the most controversial aspect of their approach. Conservative nobles still argued that the royal dragon's dependence on a human servant was a dangerous weakness, but the results were becoming impossible to ignore. Spark had exceeded every developmental milestone by significant margins. The dragon's problem-solving abilities, emotional intelligence, and physical capabilities were all far advanced for its age. More importantly, Spark showed none of the fear-based aggression that typically characterized young dragons. Instead, it approached new situations with curiosity and confidence, secure in the knowledge that it had a support system to return to if needed. The implications of this success had begun to ripple throughout the Empire. Commander had been reassigned to a frontier post after his harsh training methods were officially deemed counterproductive to optimal dragon development. Doctor had written extensively about the case, and her reports were being studied by caregivers and educators across multiple star systems. But perhaps most significantly, the way viewed humans was beginning to shift. "The Council has been debating a new proposal," Queen told Sarah one evening. "Some members believe that if humans can provide unique benefits to dragon development, we should consider expanding their roles in other areas as well." Sarah felt a mixture of hope and caution. What kind of roles? Advisory positions, specialists, emotional counselors. The humans would still be subjects of the Empire, but they would be valued subjects with important contributions to make. It was more progress than Sarah had ever dared hope for, but she knew how quickly political winds could change. And the opposition. Significant, many still view this as an unacceptable elevation of a servant species. They argue that humans are useful for certain limited tasks, but should never be given positions of real influence. Sarah understood the delicate balance they were maintaining. Spark's success had given humans an opportunity to prove their worth, but failure could result in a backlash that would make their situation even worse than before. As if sensing the serious nature of their conversation, Spark raised its head and looked between them with intelligent golden eyes. The dragon had learned to read human and body language with remarkable accuracy, and it could sense when the adults in its life were concerned about something. "What is it, little star?" Sarah asked, using her favorite nickname for the dragon. Spark made a complex vocalization that Sarah had learned meant worried question. The dragon's language abilities had developed to include dozens of different sounds with specific meanings, far beyond what any dragon expert had thought possible at this age. "We're discussing your future," Queen explained to her child. "Some people believe that your bond with Sarah makes you weak. We know better, but we must be prepared to prove it if necessary." Spark's response was immediate and unambiguous. The dragon moved protectively closer to Sarah while maintaining eye contact with its mother, clearly indicating that it understood the political implications and had strong opinions about them. "Smart child," Queen murmured approvingly. "It knows that its strength comes from its bonds, not from isolation." That strength would be tested sooner than any of them anticipated. The crisis began with reports of a rogue dragon terrorizing the outer colonies. Thor the Destroyer was an ancient dragon who had been exiled from the Empire decades ago for crimes against the royal family. Intelligence reports suggested that he had gathered a small fleet of pirates and rebels and was planning an attack on the capital world. "One dragon, even an ancient one, should not pose a significant threat to our defenses," General explained during the emergency council meeting. "However, Thor has knowledge of our military strategies and defensive capabilities from his time as a royal guardian. He could cause substantial damage before being defeated." Queen's expression was grim. "What does he want?" "He has demanded that you meet him in single combat, as is his right under the old laws. He claims that your rule has made the Empire weak and that he should replace you as the rightful leader." Sarah felt her blood run cold. She had learned enough about culture to know that ritual combat challenges could not be refused without losing face and legitimacy. "When?" the Queen asked. "He will arrive at the edge of our system in 3 days. The combat is to take place on the neutral moon with representatives from both sides present as witnesses." Sarah thought about Queen facing an ancient warrior dragon who had spent decades perfecting his combat skills in the lawless outer regions. The Queen was powerful and skilled, but she had been focused on ruling an empire rather than preparing for personal combat. "Your Majesty," Sarah said carefully, "is there any way to avoid this confrontation?" "Not without appearing weak before the entire empire," the Queen replied. "Weakness invites rebellion. I must face him." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She walked through the palace gardens, trying to think of some way to help Queen prepare for what seemed like an impossible challenge. The Queen was a skilled fighter, but Thor was a legend whose reputation for ruthless violence was known throughout the galaxy. She found herself in the communications center, where she had occasionally sent messages to other humans in the Empire. On impulse, she began researching everything she could find about Thor's history and previous battles. What she discovered was disturbing. Thor had never lost a single combat challenge in over 2 centuries. His tactics were brutally efficient, and he showed no mercy to defeated opponents. Worse, he was known for psychological warfare, finding ways to unnerve his opponents before the fighting even began. But as Sarah read through the historical records, she began to notice a pattern. Thor's victories were often achieved through intimidation as much as skill. He would study his opponent's weaknesses and exploit them ruthlessly, but his approach was always the same: isolate his enemy, break their confidence, and then finish them when they were already defeated in spirit. It was the opposite of everything Sarah had learned about building strength through connection and support. "Sarah," Queen's voice came from behind her. "What are you doing here?" Sarah turned to find the Queen standing in the doorway, looking exhausted and worried. "I was researching Thor, trying to find something that might help." "And what did you discover?" "He wins by making his opponents feel alone and afraid. All of his psychological tactics are designed to isolate people from their sources of strength." Queen sat down beside Sarah, her usually perfect posture showing signs of strain. I have been preparing for this challenge my entire life, yet I find myself uncertain. Thor's reputation is formidable. Your Majesty, may I ask you something? Of course. When Spark was sick and dying because of the separation, what saved it? The Queen was quiet for a moment, understanding the implication of the question. Knowing that it was loved unconditionally, having someone who would never abandon it regardless of the circumstances. Exactly. Thor's strength comes from being alone, from not depending on anyone or anything. But your strength comes from your connections, from knowing that people believe in you and support you. You believe I should face him with that mindset. I believe you should face him knowing that you're not alone, that you have a daughter who needs you, subjects who respect you, and friends who care about you. That's not weakness, Your Majesty. That's the kind of strength that can't be defeated in combat because it exists beyond any single moment or challenge. Queen looked at Sarah with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. You suggest that I draw strength from my bonds rather than trying to match his isolation. I suggest that you remember why you're fighting, not to prove that you're the strongest individual warrior, but to protect everyone and everything you care about. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Spark, now large enough to fly significant distances, refused to remain in the palace while its mother prepared to leave for the combat challenge. The child insists on accompanying the royal party, caretaker reported with obvious concern. It becomes extremely agitated when we attempt to separate it from either you or the Queen. Sarah looked at Spark, who was making the complex vocalizations that meant determined insistence. The dragon had grown large enough to be impressive, but it was still young and untested in any kind of combat situation. Absolutely not, Queen said firmly. The journey too is dangerous and the combat itself could become unpredictable. I will not risk my child's safety. But Spark had inherited its mother's stubbornness. The dragon planted itself firmly between Sarah and the Queen and refused to move, making it clear that it considered them both part of its family unit and would not be separated from them during a time of crisis. It understands what's happening, Sarah realized. Spark knows you're facing danger and it wants to be there to support you. It's too young to be exposed to such violence. Maybe, but it's not too young to understand loyalty and love. After hours of discussion and debate, a compromise was reached. Spark would accompany the royal party but would remain with Sarah in the observers area, well away from the actual combat zone. The dragon would be able to see that its family was safe while being protected from direct involvement in the fighting. The journey took 2 days aboard the royal flagship. Sarah spent most of the time helping Queen prepare mentally and emotionally for the challenge ahead. They discussed strategy, but more importantly, they talked about all the reasons the Queen had for returning home safely. Spark will need guidance as it grows older, Sarah said as they watched the neutral moon grow larger in the viewport. It will face its own challenges and need someone who understands what it's like to carry responsibility for others. I know, the Queen replied. That knowledge is both my greatest motivation and my greatest source of fear. If I fail, what happens to my child? You won't fail, not because you're necessarily stronger than Thor, but because you're fighting for something larger than yourself. Was a barren moon with an atmosphere maintained by artificial generators, designated as neutral territory for exactly this kind of ritual combat. The fighting arena was a simple circle of sand surrounded by energy barriers, with observation platforms for witnesses from both sides. Thor had arrived hours earlier, and Sarah got her first look at the legendary warrior dragon as their party approached the arena. He was massive, easily twice Queen's size, with dark red scales that looked like dried blood and eyes like burning coals. His presence radiated menace and barely controlled violence. Worse, he wasn't alone. He has brought supporters, General observed grimly. Former Imperial guards who followed him into exile, plus several pirate captains who have pledged loyalty to his cause. Sarah counted at least 24 figures on Thor's observation platform, all of them armed and hostile. By contrast, the Queen's party consisted of only a handful of essential personnel, plus Sarah and Spark. The numbers don't matter for ritual combat, Queen said, but Sarah could see the concern in her eyes. However, they suggest that Thor has greater support for his rebellion than we anticipated. As they took their positions on the observation platform, Sarah felt Spark pressing close against her. The young dragon was trying to appear brave, but she could sense its fear and confusion. This was the first time Spark had been exposed to genuinely hostile beings, and the experience was overwhelming. "It's going to be all right," Sarah whispered, stroking the dragon's scales gently. "Your mother is strong and smart and fighting for all the right reasons." Thor's voice boomed across the arena as he addressed Queen before the combat began. "You have made the Empire weak with your soft policies and tolerance for inferior species. Today I will restore the natural order by claiming your throne." His gaze fixed on Sarah and Spark with obvious contempt. "I see you have brought your pet human and her corrupted dragon child. How fitting that you surround yourself with symbols of the Empire's decay." Sarah felt Spark tense beside her, the young dragon's protective instincts aroused by the threat to its family. She placed a calming hand on Spark's neck, but she could feel the dragon's anger building. "My strength comes from understanding that true power is found in unity, not isolation," Queen replied. "My child and my advisor are here because they represent the future of our empire, a future you cannot comprehend." Thor laughed, a sound like breaking stone. "We shall see whose understanding proves superior." The combat began with ritual formalities, but quickly escalated to vicious attacks as both dragons took to the air. Queen was faster and more agile, but Thor's size and experience gave him significant advantages. The sound of their aerial battle was deafening, echoing off the moon's artificial atmosphere generators. Sarah watched in terror as Thor managed to rake his claws across the Queen's flank, drawing first blood. The crowd of rebels on his platform cheered, while Sarah felt Spark's muscles coiling with the desire to help its mother. "She's hurt," Sarah murmured, seeing the Queen's flight pattern become less steady. But Queen wasn't fighting the way Thor expected. Instead of engaging in direct power struggles where his size gave him the advantage, she was using tactics that emphasized speed, intelligence, and precision. She was fighting like someone who had responsibilities beyond personal glory, someone who needed to survive to take care of others. The turning point came when Thor attempted one of his signature moves, a devastating aerial dive that had ended many previous combats. Queen didn't try to meet him head-on or dodge at the last second as he expected. Instead, she used his momentum against him, redirecting his attack in a way that sent him crashing into the arena floor. "Impossible," one of the rebels on the opposing platform gasped. "No one has ever countered the falling hammer strike." But Queen had done something unprecedented. She had fought not as an isolated warrior trying to prove individual superiority, but as a protector using every tool and technique available to ensure she could return home to those who depended on her. Thor struggled to his feet, blood streaming from multiple wounds. For the first time in centuries, he looked genuinely surprised and uncertain. His tactics had always worked before because they were designed to break the spirit of opponents who were fighting for personal glory or status. They didn't work against someone who was fighting for love. "You think your soft emotions make you strong," Thor snarled, launching himself at the Queen again. "I'll show you the price of weakness." But his attacks were becoming desperate and sloppy. Queen continued to fight with precise, efficient movements, never wasting energy on displays of dominance or attempts to inflict unnecessary pain. She was fighting to end the threat, not to prove her superiority. The end came suddenly. Thor, frustrated by his inability to break the Queen's resolve, overextended himself in a rage-fueled attack. Queen stepped aside at precisely the right moment and struck with surgical precision at the base of his neck, severing several crucial muscle groups. Thor crashed to the ground, paralyzed but alive. According to the rules of ritual combat, Queen had won and could choose to spare or execute her defeated opponent. Sarah held her breath as the Queen approached the fallen rebel. This decision would say everything about what kind of leader she chose to be. "You are defeated," Queen said clearly, her voice carrying across the arena. "But you are not without value. Your combat skills are formidable, and your passion for the Empire's strength is genuine, even if your methods were misguided. I offer you a choice." Thor glared up at her with hatred and confusion. He had clearly expected to be executed. "You may face death with honor, as is your right as a defeated warrior. Or you may accept exile to the research stations on the Outer Rim, where your knowledge and skills can contribute to the Empire's expansion into new territories. You will never again be permitted in the core systems, but you will have the opportunity to serve a purpose greater than yourself." It was unprecedented. No combat challenge in history had ended with an offer of productive exile rather than death or unconditional surrender. Thor was silent for a long time, his ancient mind struggling to process this unexpected development. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I choose exile, and I acknowledge your victory, your majesty." The arena fell silent as the implications sank in. Queen had not only won the combat challenge, she had demonstrated a completely new approach to leadership, one that emphasized strength through mercy, power through connection, and victory through protecting rather than destroying. As the royal party prepared to return to the capital, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening. Several of Thor's supporters had approached General to inquire about terms for their own return to legitimate service. The Queen's display of strength tempered with compassion had impressed even those who had come to support her opponent. "You were right," Queen told Sarah as they boarded the flagship. "My strength did come from my connections. Knowing that Spark needed me to return home safely gave me focus and determination that mere personal pride never could have provided." Spark, who had watched the entire combat with wide, fascinated eyes, made a complex series of vocalizations that Sarah translated as proud of strong mother who protects family. "And what did you learn from watching?" the Queen asked her child. Spark's response was immediate and clear. The young dragon had learned that true strength wasn't about being the biggest or most frightening presence in the room. True strength was about being willing to fight for others, about using power to protect rather than dominate, and about having the wisdom to show mercy when victory was achieved. The journey home was very different from their departure. News of the Queen's victory and her unprecedented offer of mercy to Thor had spread throughout the Empire with unprecedented speed. But more than that, reports were coming in from across the star systems about humans in various settlements who were being approached by local leaders for advice on education and community building. The success of the human approach to caring for Spark had opened minds throughout the Empire. Suddenly, humans were being seen not just as a conquered species to be managed, but as a resource with unique insights and abilities that could benefit everyone. "It's not just about Spark anymore," Sarah realized as she read through the communications. "What we learned about the importance of emotional security and supportive relationships is being applied everywhere." "Indeed," Queen agreed. "My victory over Thor proved that strength through connection is superior to strength through isolation. Now the entire Empire is beginning to understand that diversity of thought and approach makes us all stronger." Sarah looked at Spark, who was now large enough to carry her short distances in flight and smart enough to understand most adult conversations. The dragon had grown up knowing that it was loved unconditionally while also being challenged to develop its capabilities to the fullest. The result was a young being that was confident, compassionate, intelligent, and powerful in ways that went far beyond physical strength. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Queen smiled, an expression that had become much more common since Spark's arrival in their lives. "Now we continue to grow and learn together. The Empire has been changed by a human maid who is willing to sing to a frightened baby dragon. I suspect there are many more changes to come as we discover what else we can accomplish when we combine our different strengths." As their ship approached the capital world, Sarah could see crowds gathering at the spaceports. Word of their return had preceded them, and it seemed like half the planet wanted to welcome home their queen and the young dragon who had become a symbol of hope for a new kind of future. Spark pressed against the viewport, wings fluttering with excitement at the sight of home. The dragon made a joyful sound that Sarah had learned meant safe place with people who love us. And that, Sarah thought, was exactly what they had created together. Not just a safe place, but a foundation for building a future where strength came from connection, where power was used to protect and nurture, and where even the smallest voice could change the course of empires if it was singing the right song. The baby dragon who had once screamed in terror and loneliness had grown into a symbol of what was possible when different beings chose to care for each other. And the human maid who had sung through her shopping list to comfort a frightened child had helped transform an entire galactic civilization's understanding of true strength. Sometimes, the most powerful force in the universe wasn't conquest or domination or technological superiority. Sometimes it was just love, offered freely and without condition, sung in a simple human voice to anyone who needed to hear it.